Welcome to Le Arte dell'Arme, the Bolognese podcast, where we discuss the intricacies of the Bolognese tradition with the practitioners, translators, authors, and teachers working to bring the art back to life. Today's guest is Martin. Martin is a reenactor and fencing instructor with Shildwache Potsdam and has been practicing Western martial arts for over 13 years. Martin was recently named to the DDHF National Longsword Squad and will be representing Germany in the international HEMA competition. Martin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you. I think a lot of people are going to recognize you from your prodigious output on your YouTube channel, the Shildwache Potsdam YouTube channel, where you've done a tremendous amount of work in developing your interpretations and putting them out there for everybody to see. Tell me a little bit about your martial arts background and how you got started in the Bolognese system.
All right, so I actually started my martial arts career with judo. Like I was always a sportive person, and in my youth, I started with wrestling basically. Then I transitioned, tried boxing, tried kung fu, each for a couple of years. And when I transitioned to sword fighting, like when I visited a medieval fair and saw a couple of guys from the Berliner Rittergilde show fight and reenact stuff, I thought to myself, that's it. That's where I have to stick. And since then, I've practiced sword fighting ever since. And a few years later, I asked myself, okay, how did they really fight in medieval and Renaissance times? And I looked in the internet for text on how to sword fight. I stumbled on YouTube over the videos of Roland Vazecha and Federico Malaguti, and their material on 133 really spoke to me. And that's where I picked up sword and buckler. And I proposed to my university, the University of Potsdam, that HEMA course is really necessary for this university sports program. And since they already knew me, since I was an instructor for other courses as well, that's where Shildwache Potsdam really started.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I was gonna ask, in terms of, or at least context of the time, how you ended up becoming a Guelph instead of a Ghibelline, and studying the Italian sources instead of the German sources.
Yeah, well, so I started with 133, which is still great, to be honest, but it's really hard to interpret. And yeah, when I thought to myself, okay, I'm not really making a lot of progress here anymore, I started to broaden my view. And the Bolognese system, or more specifically Manciolino sword and buckler, was like just the bit I needed to get me started into a more like wholesome journey for sword and buckler. From there, I progressed to Giovanni della Gocchia and to Marozzo, to the Anonimo and Vigiani and all the other awesome authors of the Renaissance times. And yeah, since then, I really pretty much stuck with the Bolognese sources as my main project.
Yeah, I think that's one of the really awesome benefits of the Bolognese tradition is, the benefit of printing, and the concept that, you can put a word count that is much higher and you don't have scribes specifically writing in books, like in I-33, where we have, instances of scribes not actually finishing pages and writing in their lines, or even even talking smack about the illustrators and saying that they drew the pictures wrong for certain techniques. So we definitely have the benefit of more language, and the language really helps to sort of provide context and really build out the system.
Definitely, yeah. When they, I think, have like the same images over and over again, and he describes like, yeah, that's the thing we've seen several times before.
Yeah.
And here they forgot to draw the actual technique, which will not be able to we will not be able to see them later anyway, because these guys didn't draw them.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I to sort of speak to I-33 a little bit. I I find I-33 really fascinating because it's com- it's incredibly complex, but it's incredibly simple at the same time. You know, it's if they get an overbind, then you flip. If they, if you have the overbind, then you go in and you do your Shildwache and then, cut them in the face. Um, but there's this really interesting sort of pedagogical approach to I-33 that is really fascinating to me. And I'm working on sort of rounding out the idea of it in my head now because I'm starting to see it exist in other areas of fencing, where you have your transitory guards in I-33, like Crook and Half Shield and the priest special wards and things like that. And those almost represent like an obligation, like you come to Shildwache and you're essentially saying, okay, you're going to either bind my sword or you're going to do nothing, right? So you either deal with the threat or you don't. And if you don't, then, a lot of times he says, okay, then you just stab him in the face or cut him or do whatever you're going to do. um, but then it kind of shows us how we can really bring everything together in terms of starting from, even in the Bolognese tradition, starting from a wide
Definitely.
guard and transitioning to a narrow guard to try to get that advantage. How have you seen that kind of play out in your studies?
Yeah, definitely. So after all these years, I think 133 and the Bolognese system are pretty similar in certain aspects, actually. Like 133 focuses a lot on the strata plays, so like in the bind.
Mhm,
But it has some snippets where you're told, like, you perform your provocation, or 133, it's an obsessio.
mhm,
And if they don't react, you don't hesitate and just stab them or strike them or whatever. Much like in the Bolognese system, where we use a provocation to provoke them for a predictable action, which we can then abuse, or where we move them into a worse position than before, and we ourselves get into a better position. I think these aspects are quite similar, actually. The problem with 133 is that we are often not told in too much detail on how to get there. Like when we're out of distance, how do we step in? When do we raise our shield and sword into like half shield, for example?
mhm.
Or like what do we do if an opponent does not one of the things we are expecting them to do? So then that's where it really gets hard. This and also the flattened art style can be quite challenging as well.
Yeah, yeah. If only they had the Marozzo footwork grid down at the very bottom so we could actually
Definitely.
get some perspective. Yeah, that would be great. So, you know, uh, you were talking a little bit about Manciolino and how he was really kind of your introduction to the Bolognese system, but you've also done a ton of work with Delagoche, and really some of the best I've seen in terms of especially introducing beginners to the postures, the forms, and everything like that. Because you have great posture. You have your form is fantastic. Um, and now you seem to have transitioned into really getting into Marozzo. So you've been producing a lot of content on Marozzo. So do you have an author that you prefer, or are you sort of agnostic when it comes to the authors?
Well, first, thank you. It's a really great compliment and something I strive for, like good form, and actually to bring new people into our hobby, because like Delagoche says, we have to get to fans with a lot of different training partners. And that's only possible if there are a lot of training partners. So that's one of the purposes of my YouTube channel. As for the authors, I don't know. I don't think I have like a personal favorite. There's like phases where I like this and that author more, and where I work with the system of certain authors more, like Manciolino, then transition to another, then revisit Manciolino again and stuff. No, I don't think I have a personal favorite, and I think they are all awesome for very specific reasons. Like Dall'Agocchio is great if you just want to learn single sword, or really it's great for any beginner who wants to just understand why we do the stuff we do in the Bolognese systems the way we do them. Like he's really clear on, okay, these are the actions you take if your opponent is in that position, much like 133 for that. But if you want to go into like sword and buckler fighting, then Manciolino is great because he's very clear and precise in his actions as well. On the other hand, he can be a bit thin on the why. So that's maybe where Marozzo comes into play, who can be really detailed in his descriptions. Or the Anonimo when we want to learn how to transition from a blade action into a wrestling action. So they're all awesome, and I would miss any one of them very much if they were missing.
Yeah, I think one of the great things about the variety of the authors is that, you know, we have so much material and the different styles of the different authors, so that each author provides a different perspective on how the fight is developed. And even when you combine certain systems, especially with Manciolino, like looking at Manciolino's sword and large buckler, you have this system that is very direct. You know, he's telling you that you're fighting with a sharp sword and that you have to, you know, treat it with a certain level of respect. And then you go and you look at Marozzo's sword and target material, because I think Manciolino says that you can use a sword and large buckler or target. It doesn't matter. He sort of doesn't really care what you use in that situation. But you look at Marozzo's sword and target material, and elements of the sort of individual techniques that Manciolino talks about are prevalent all the way throughout Marozzo and his sword and target material. And it's like Marozzo takes the techniques of Manciolino and just builds them out into this continuous action. And so I love that you have these perspectives where you have some of the authors like Dall'Agocchio and Manciolino that really provide the very basic progression of the techniques, you know, just like, hey, this is a good way to parry and guardia di testa and then cut the leg, right? And then Marozzo's like, okay, we're going to parry and guardia di testa, we're going to feint to the leg, and then we're going to stab them up underneath our buckler, you know. And I just love that sense of, now we're going to start to add deception and sort of these other elements of fencing.
Yeah, very true. It's like the whole compendium is what makes the Bolognese system so special.
Yeah, for sure. So, you know, do you think that sword and buckler is still your favorite weapon and combination now that you've kind of gone through so much material, or have you started to find a liking to something else?
Well, to be honest, I pretty much love any weapon or a weapon system. I just love martial arts. So no, I don't think I have a favorite. I still love to fight with sword and buckler. I still love to fight with longsword. And you get many sparring partners if you practice these weapon systems.
Yeah.
But I really think to understand the whole system, you have to practice and learn every aspect of it. So starting with wrestling, single sword, sword and buckler, sword and dagger, sword and cloak, two-handed sword, two swords. It's just so much and so awesome.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and you know, we were having a conversation the other day, talking about Palladini and Palladini's advice that, you know, you should learn every weapon that you possibly can get your hands on, because you never know like what situation, if you're going to get called into the militia and you're going to have to stand before a captain and show him your skill. You should be proficient in arms, you know, and that almost feels like that's sort of the core of what the Bolognese authors are teaching us, with really treating every weapon with so much material, that they really are preparing us for, you know, being complete martial artists. And it's really fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. And it's it just makes a good martial artist if you study the whole system. And that's what's really awesome. You not only learn like tricks, you learn like the concepts behind them, and you learn to apply them to all situations.
Yeah. And different weapons can inform different styles of fighting. I think Moreno was talking about how partisan and using the partisan really taught him to, like, highlighted the concept of the falsata for him as he was learning, working with the two-handed sword. Um, and even taking I feel like taking the Bolognese dagger material really teaches you how to get in close with your opponent and start to go for some of those grappling techniques and things like that, or do really short parries that put you in a strong position and constrain your opponent.
Definitely. And yeah, like I said, the Bolognese sources can be a bit thin on the why we do things. But if we contrast the different weapon systems and which actions are used in the different weapon systems, we can somehow form at least an educated guess on why we do the things the way we do it.
Yeah. So what are some of the challenges that you've faced in developing your interpretations, and how have you overcome them?
Oh, well, I don't think, first of all, that I've overcome all the challenges. I don't think I have like a finished interpretation of anything. It's like more, so the process of interpreting for me is like, I read the text, I come up with an interpretation, if you want to call it like that. I work on it a bit again, test it for body mechanics, try it in sparring. Then I check for the opinions of other peers, like on YouTube, Reddit, and stuff, or in the Giovanni Della Rocchia forum on Facebook. It's really great as well. I revisit my own interpretation time and time again. I discuss it with my course. Then I maybe progress to a different weapon set. And then I come back again with new insights, hopefully. And that's where I try to shoot the videos I make for YouTube. These are pretty much a reference point for me, and hopefully a useful reference point for others as well. So the discussions from these videos help me to reimagine all the possibilities the text can mean once again, and like really sharpen my opinion and the arguments for specific actions and against them. So I think it's a ongoing process pretty much. So it takes several years until I have a working interpretation, and I think it will take several more until I can say, yep, that's a good action. You can practice these. They probably meant this action, and you can apply it in sparring, in free fighting, in tournaments like you want.
Yeah, I always kind of think of tournaments being the sort of the crown of how you determine whether or not an interpretation really works, because it's either going to absolutely destroy your perspective on your interpretation, or it's going to validate it. And it's a really useful tool in that way.
Definitely. Yeah, never underestimate the importance of tournaments for one's own interpretation.
Yeah, that's a good way to and you have a really unique and very humble approach. And I feel like, because of how like finished and beautiful you make your videos, because do you have any background in like graphic design? How do you?
So I actually studied economics, and I work at the university. So where I publish learning material and videos.
Gotcha.
So that's pretty much my experience. And I think to really like educate people, you not only have to show the stuff, like the correct stuff, but you also have to entertain them. So it has to be appealing, and that's where I only shoot stuff if I think my form is somewhat appealing.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. That's very brilliant. So let's talk a little bit about two swords. You've done a lot of material lately with the two swords from Marozzo. How do you feel about that material? And have you done any sort of work with Manciolino or any other of the other authors?
Yeah, so the two swords material of Marozzo, I think it's great. It's pretty good if you're just starting out with two swords, actually, because you're told what your opponent does. So it's fairly easy to imagine where these techniques are applied. So that's my favorite part about it. The actions themselves can be a bit tricky at times, but I think my current interpretation is at least good to go, good to test in sparring. Let's say good to test in sparring. That's the next step, to test them in full speed sparring, and hopefully like in a tournament or situation as well anytime soon, as COVID permits. I've dabbled into Manciolino, but actually two swords, I practice this since 2020, when in February Jacopo Penzo held a workshop at the English Side Sword Open. So it's actually not that long of a time. I dabble into Manciolino, yeah, and I wouldn't say I have an interpretation for all the actions yet, which is really useful or really solid. But I think they have a lot in common. Like the Marozzo return from play is really similar to the Manciolino entrance, and the action he performs several times during the play as well, like the double falsi from one side into the double true edge strikes. It's just different starting positions. So it's really nice to see where this action, which Marozzo uses as a return from play, might be useful even within the play. So it's kind of great.
Yeah, no, it is really great. I agree with you about Manciolino. It is kind of unfortunate that we don't get the sort of B side of, or the scholar side of what's happening in his progression. I know that when we were developing our interpretation of Manciolino, it was very much just your opponent giving you counterbinds. But the one thing that I do love about Manciolino is that there's such a concise flow, where you almost feel like you're chasing, just, because you're constantly, getting the advantage, and then, or flanking your opponent and going back and forth with all these different actions. But Marozzo, to me, in trying to apply these techniques in sparring, feels a lot more applicable. I definitely find myself pulling off Marozzo's techniques in sparring a lot more than I do Manciolino. But that said, I think all of the two sword material is really brilliant. It's some of my favorite material in terms of learning fencing. Like Palladini actually says that you should start with two swords, or you should learn single sword first, and then you should learn two swords as a way to learn how to use your left hand, which I always thought was really interesting, especially because, Marozzo puts the two sword material, it's pretty far up in his book. It's before you really kind of get into some of the other materials. So, maybe he treated it a similar way, where, two sword was something that he would teach early on. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think is it before the Rotella stuff? I don't know actually by heart.
I think got it right here. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think as well, Manciolino feels really great. It feels at times like a Godinho solo drill, one versus many, actually. So it's really awesome to just get into the flow of the weapons, which is really great. And he has some pretty good advice how to react to the opponent's attacks. Like if he attacks on your left, always use your left sword. If he attacks on your right, always use your right sword to defend and counter with the left, which is then again the same thing Marozzo actually does in his play, but he doesn't describe it like that.
Yeah, definitely. And to some degree, Palladini does, well, he does a little bit different. He ends up having you, so you always with Palladini have one sword high and one sword low, and your high sword will deliver an attack and then close the line, and then the other hand will go high to then present another threat. And you kind of have this like back and forth with your hands going from high to low and transitioning like that. But that said, there are some very similar actions, especially with his low parry, if they end up cutting to your leg, sort of turning that true edge down and off to the side. He does a similar action like that. There's some pretty good stuff in there. It's very short, but it's fascinating. I love it. I mean,
yeah,
looking at
there's just so much stuff to read. So
there really is.
Yeah, so Bolognese system isn't just awesome in itself. There are so many contemporary authors who write about the same stuff and where we can get additional insights from. So it's really great. So it's really complete in its time, in its context. And so we can learn a lot of things from it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think about like Godinho's material with two swords, and it sort of representing what you're going to do in a street fight. I find it kind of interesting because Palladini gives this interesting anecdote at the end of his chapter on two swords where he talks about how he has one hand high and one hand low, like Docciolini and Altoni. And then he says you would assume Marozzo's guards where your hands are together, he says like a two-handed sword, if you were fighting multiple opponents, right? But Marozzo never really talks about fighting multiple opponents. He always talks about really just dealing with one opponent. But then we get Godinho's material where you turn into like a, two-sword helicopter of death. And you're just like, and I just find it really fascinating that you have these different perspectives on and practical usages of two swords.
Yeah, definitely. We always talk about two swords on the battlefield and how it's not the most useful weapon. But to be honest, battlefield situations aren't and probably weren't that common in that time. So it was far more likely to get into a dangerous situation in a civilian context. And there, two swords present a couple of great advantages, like Manciolino and Marozzo say. Like it's a really beneficial weapon combination and has actually some advantages versus sword and buckler or sword and dagger.
Yeah, the extra offense really helps.
Yeah.
And I think this is what I find really fascinating about the two sword material is that it is so bind oriented. Everything, you're constantly counterbinding, finding your opponent's sword and then coming through, and then perhaps they start to counter your counterbind, so then you drop a sword up underneath, create another counterbind, and then come through and you might do a full cut. And from that perspective, there's just so much complexity because you are dealing with two swords and you have the leverage of both swords, and the natural measure of two swords I feel like is a little bit shorter. Like you don't get as many wide play actions because if you do, a lot of times you're still counterbinding and then doing a wide play action because you still have one sword in presence, and so it gives you this advantage where you can kind of string those two things together and do both stretta and sort of larga actions or assume larga guards like in one continuation.
Yeah, definitely. I think in his two sword section, Marozzo is actually a bit more defensively minded in comparison to his other sections. Maybe because the opponent also has two swords, and that's like really a lot of factors you have to keep in mind. So you actually seek the bind with one sword at least to have that additional information on pressure, on where the opponent goes. unlike just to keep oneself safe.
Yeah. And it seems like when he does attack, it's very, you know, through the first portion of the book, our attacks are usually initiated with a falso to the hand.
Hmm.
And then however our opponent reacts to that provocation of a falso to the hand, then we will essentially counterbind and come through with a thrust or a cut. And then later on, he starts to get into some really interesting stuff where, you know, you throw that falso in puntanto, like in the seventh one, which
Yeah.
I love. You know, you still get the counterbind, but then you throw that falso in puntanto and then cut up underneath. And that's the one where you end up cutting down around and sort of gathering their
Yeah.
swords and then cutting through. But it's really, I think that's where, yeah, it seems very safe. It seems very provocation oriented, and more so. I mean, Marozzo does that falso to the hand as a provocation a lot, but it feels like that progression is a lot more just trying to get your opponent to come at you in some way, so that way you can counter.
Yeah, definitely. The only time I think he closes without the falso is with the like hanging parry, like where he says, if the opponent does that and that, you can parry like this. And even if he does nothing, you go with the hanging parry and then the thrust underneath or the reversal to the legs. So yeah, it's like a bit, oh, that's heresy, a bit of George Silver's True Guard.
Yeah. That is heresy. I can't believe you said that. No, just kidding. Yeah, I mean, but the interesting thing about Manciolino is perhaps Manciolino is a bit more offensive, because he doesn't give us, he doesn't really give us like solid defenses until really towards the very end, when you get your 4 basic defenses against a reversal with the or a mandrito with the right hand, a reversal with the right hand, and then a reversal with the left hand, and a mandrito with the left hand. And so you get that part at the very end, but everything up to that point is really this progression of you sort of pressuring your opponent and applying attacks, you know, and they're very similar. You know, I mean, if you were to take Manciolino's real first action, where you end up cutting, you cut up underneath, you find your opponent's sword, and then you cut in, and then you end up doing that double thrust. That progression is not really that different than what we end up seeing from Marozzo with his falso and puntanto. I mean, in terms of the concept of going for a cut underneath that then ends up finding their sword and then coming around, and he does that twice. And then he gives us his thrust, which are essentially, you know, you're counterbinding with your left sword and you're thrusting over, or you're counterbinding with your right sword and then thrusting behind your right sword. So he gives us these two very like real concepts of how to attack with 2 swords, and then some very basic defenses. So he actually, you know, I mean, there's a pretty decent system there. And Marozzo, like you said, he is very defensive. I think, I mean, we get what, like two attacks roughly, that are like true attacks. The rest of them really kind of seem like those provocations.
Yeah.
So you know, I mean, it's an interesting sort of pedagogical approach to kind of string those two together and see how you can kind of
Definitely.
integrate them.
Yeah, that's really beneficial to study both of them. Definitely. And for that instance, the other authors of that time as well, like Docciolini, Palladini, Di Grassi, these are all awesome. And we have to study them all to really understand the usage of 2 swords, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I wish I had more time.
Definitely.
Every time I mean, I think right now I'm definitely trying to come up with a solid interpretation for Palladini. I try to, in my personal study, I know, I mean, you've done a lot of work. How do you do this? So how do you really break apart your study? Like when you're going through your week and you're doing your sword study, especially like your independent study for certain systems and you're developing your techniques, like how do you string that out? How do you set that up? Do you focus on one thing at a time? Do you do a couple of different things like kind of strewn throughout the week? How do you do that?
Yeah, so I pretty much try to train every day in the week, but not for long. So like every day, 30 minutes would be great. But if it's 10 minutes only a day, that's fine as well. We have, for now, 2 group online sessions for 1 hour. And this is where I present my interpretations to my group and where we discuss them. And if they're fine, we train them. So we have solo drills to just drill these motions into our body. For my personal study time, I read the text. I read all the text I can get my hands on. And if I find the time, every other text I can get my hand on as well. And then I just get my sword in my hand and I'll try every technique I've possibly encountered which could fit the text at that portion. Actually, yeah. So I really think that interpretations aren't made out of thin air, but from our experience. Yeah, pretty much from our experience, from all the actions we've done ourselves and all the actions we've seen others do. So that's where I think these like YouTube videos are also really great, because it's one thing to describe an action, or like Marozzo and Manciolino do, they write about it, but it's totally another thing to see them in action, and possibly even with a partner.
Yeah, and you know, I kind of brought this up with when I talked to Ken Harding, but one of the things that I love about having content is even if you don't agree in the way that you've come up with your interpretation, one of the great things about having lots of different interpretations out there is that you always have something that you can kind of come back to reference. So you can either reference it and build upon it, and then if you disagree with something, you can sort of tweak the interpretation to however you like, or it gives you something to go back to if that interpretation doesn't work, right? Because I mean, we're talking about, you know, tournaments being sort of the that crown, right? And if you were to take your 2-sword interpretation into a tournament in order to fail miserably, like where do you go from there? But if you have that material out there and you can reference, especially from multiple different reference points, to see what other people have done, it's such an invaluable resource. So you're definitely doing something that is an incredible work for the greater HEMA community, and I think everybody should be appreciative of that for sure. You know, it used to be that you know, Ilko was like the only Bolognese person on YouTube, you know, but now we have so much material. Next week I'm going to talk to Jay Maxwell, and you know, Jay is producing really great material. You're producing great material. Ken Harding's producing great material.
Definitely.
You know, there's just so much great content out there, and it's great. It's really fantastic. So, yeah, we definitely appreciate you for that.
Yeah,
so
thank you. You're welcome.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about strategy and tactics of the Bolognese system. We talked a little bit about strategy and tactics of 2-sword, but let's talk about especially with single-handed sword. How do you view the strategic and tactical approach of the system?
Okay, well, I would reference to Dalagocchio for that probably, because to really comprehend the strategic mindset of the Bolognese system, I think we first have to understand tempo. And like his definition is still, I think, one of the best. So tempo, just a time measurement, like a time frame. And then we have to just understand that if someone is active and the other one is defensive, so agente, paziente, a defensive action has always to be shorter than an offensive action, because we have to finish our defense before the strike is at our head, and we have to react. So there are two things that have to happen. We have to react, we have to choose the right defense, and we have to execute that defense. So, and that's where measure comes into play. If the opponent is so close that he can perform an offensive action that is shorter than our reaction span, then we have no chance at all to perform any defense.
Yeah.
And if our sword is behind our back or really far away, so our defensive action has to be too long in proportion to the offensive action of our opponent, then we have no chance as well. So we have to get our sword mostly in front, mostly in a strata position. That's why they already recommend that, because every defensive action is a really quick one from a strata position, basically. And then we have to work for a tactical advantage to make our offensive action just that precise that the opponent cannot react. And more importantly, that from our offensive action, he cannot just also perform an offensive action that strikes us as well. So we have an additional layer of that we have to keep in mind. So we cannot just thrust around his like sword, like in the German tradition, it would be duplieren.
Mm-hmm.
But there have to be specific circumstances for that to work. Like the point of the opponent is offline, so the pressure is sideways, like not to us. These are like conditions that have to be true if we want to perform certain actions. And it all springs from that concept of tempo. That's really awesome.
Yeah. So just to build on that a little bit, and sort of hopefully further discussion a little bit, looking at Viggiani, I think the first time this really clicked with me is when I read Viggiani and his discussion of tempo and Aristotle, and really defined what time was, and saying, when you cut from a high guard to cut to a low guard, the time it takes for the sword to complete that cut, that's tempo, right? And that concept shows up so much throughout all the other texts. Viggiani spells it out in a very sort of Aristotelian manner, which is nice because it definitely links us to other systems in like the European sword fighting traditions. I mean, even looked in our references Aristotle. So, that's great. But then we get things like, Manciolino saying, since no blow can reasonably be performed without ending in a guard, the virtue of a fencer is found in the raising and lowering of the guards. In consequence of this principle, he who renews his attack before setting in a guard will be more apt to win. This is because it's easier to attack an opponent whose action is interrupted, right? And so there he's talking about attacking somebody in the tempo of their action, sort of like what you were talking about of interrupting their tempo. And I mean, Marozzo gives a similar sort of run of instructions in his third section of two-handed sword, where he just randomly starts talking about tempo for the first time in the entire book. But he starts randomly talking about tempo in the two-handed sword section. And he essentially says to do the same thing. He says to try to catch your opponent between rising and falling. And we see that concept come up a lot in other systems. I mean, for all intents and purposes, that is indes, right?
Yep.
And so you're right in that, like, and I really agree with you that tempo and measure in particular are so incredibly important. And measure is something that is really hard for some people to understand, especially in the HEMA world. It seems like we're talking about fighting in tournaments. It seems that
it's also really depends on the individual. Like if you're fencing a really athletic fencer, measure becomes something completely different. He can strike you in that little time from much further away. So, and if you're fencing with another fencer, you can maybe get a lot more closer. So it's really hard to get your measure right.
Yeah, it is. And, the length of an opponent's weapon,
Yeah.
Manciolino actually talks about that quite a bit in his introduction, where if you end up fighting somebody in a duel,
Mhm.
if you're shorter, make sure that your taller opponent has has a shorter weapon than you do when you select the weapons. And so we get I mean, this is definitely something that they were thinking about. But when you think about measure from a broad context and maybe it's more of a simplified context, how do you sort of define measure? How do you teach measure when you're teaching your students?
Mhm. So if I teach a new student measure, I pretty much divide it into three different ones, like out of measure, like then the measure if you're like white measure, if you can strike your opponent, but it takes a pretty long time and they're able to react. And then there's a short measure or strata. And that's where like every action counts and there's actually no time to hesitate, to reference back to 133 once again. There's no time to hesitate, no time to think. If you think your opponent can already be performing his offensive action, you have no time to react for your own defense. So you have to really be apt to like control the center and then strike from there. Always never only think about winning the bind, but think about how you can win the bind to strike them, to provoke them, or to lead to the next action. That's, I think, a thing that's really hard to comprehend for a beginning fencer. And like the anonymous says, it comes with experience.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, to sort of uh, provide a textual base to what you just said, Manciolino says that you should never perform any sort of a parry without performing a riposte.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. So, um, yeah, I completely agree with that. So one of the things that you said earlier, I think is actually really important and something that I think exists, especially we see a lot more talked about in the rapier traditions, but the concept of making sure that your tempo is smaller than your opponent's tempo, um, that is really a lot of what I think the Bolognese authors are talking about, but not necessarily getting as directly to the point as later
Yeah,
authors do.
definitely.
It's like they had a broader understanding and a better way of sort of contextualizing these things and explaining them in a simple manner. Um, One of the best explanations of that actually comes in the anonymous Vienna, which is a student of Fabris, but I think it's something that we see really played out throughout, all of the Bolognese texts. Um, what are some actions that you do with your students to kind of really focus on the tempos and teaching the tempos?
So I actually adapted like an open hand drill from Kung Fu, like just to get to know the feeling of when you are too close to react. Both people start with their hands stretched far away from them, and the aim is to touch the shoulder of the opponent.
Mm.
So they both are in contact, or maybe they both even start without contact. And then one is offensive and the other one has to defend by just pushing their arm away. First without contact. And it's pretty soon that they recognize that they can get a lot closer with contact than without, because they have that additional pressure information.
Mm.
And like really experience by hand, by practice, like Manciolino says, we experience by practice with our head, how things feel. When can we perform like a defense and immediately riposte, for example? And that's a drill. I think which is really beneficial for both of them, to just experience what tempi are, how long tempi feel, and what mezzi tempi are, basically.
Nice. Yeah, that's awesome. Um, So let's see. What is something that you think that we as a community can do to improve upon to better reflect the sources in our fencing?
Well, I think we are actually on a good way, like exchanging information, discussing. It's like, yeah, it's an academic process. And that really works well through instances like YouTube, Facebook, and other stuff. It's really great that people like Ken, Ilka, and stuff share their interpretations. I think that's super important. Where we can do better, well, more people just have to do it. So it's really important to get new people into this hobby, to get more interpretations, to get all the text filmed and recorded, get every session recorded, get more sparring footage, tournament footage, and look for techniques in that tournament which could fit the text, for example. Yeah, so that could be a way to find new valid interpretations. Yeah, pretty definitely more people, more time. that's the greatest challenge for now, at least for me.
Yeah, that's I think I agree. That is really important. And new perspectives, right? I
Yeah.
mean, a lot of people see things from different ways, as we've kind of talked about, and having more people really kind of share their experience, share what works, especially validated techniques, things that they really feel like they've pressure tested and are working really well. Um, being able to articulate those and get those out there so other people can try them and try to validate their techniques will really kind of help us, because I feel like, especially for the Bolognese community, um, I feel like it's growing a lot right now,
Mhm.
you know? Um,
Yeah, luckily.
yeah, but we haven't had the texts as long as, people in the KDF tradition. They've been working from their texts for a lot longer. They've got a lot of people who have been working really diligently for decades to try to pressure test and come up with their interpretations. And if you talk to a KDF practitioner now, I don't think that there's nearly as much indecision or sort of unsettledness that comes with what we're seeing in the Bolognese tradition. We have the benefit of authors that write a lot more. So
Mhm.
there's a lot, I think there's a lot less, there's more material, but there's a lot less material that's sort of ununderstood. But there's still some things out there that are kind of, oh, I do it this way. You know, I've had a lot of conversations recently about what is a traversado?
Mhm.
What is a falso impuntanto? What makes a falso impuntanto a falso impuntanto, and is it different with a two-handed sword or a one-handed sword? Um, and maybe these are things that'll never go away, but we still have a lot of things that we can sort of diligently work to kind of understand. And I think we're kind of on that path, but it will take more people and more perspectives to really kind of hone it in the way that other traditions have kind of done so.
Yeah, definitely. It's like Dalagokye says, you have to train with a lot of different partners. And that's because we need to experience that variation in techniques, in body size, in performing the actual techniques, in pressure. Like just, it's so important to have like your boundaries pushed far and far away to really broaden your view and yeah, to really comprehend the system.
Yeah. So what are you working on next? What can we expect from you in the YouTube world?
Okay, so right now we are still in lockdown in Germany, so we have to keep some distance. But actually, last weekend I got to Potsdam once again, and we filmed some stuff with the Partisan and Rotella, actually, and
Awesome.
as a partnered exercise. So I think that will be the next thing in a few weeks, I guess.
Fantastic. That's going to be great. Um, so have you looked at any of the anonymous plays with single-handed sword against partisan?
Not yet, to be honest, but that's definitely the next on the list. So I read through it once, I have my interpretation, quote unquote.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's still a work in progress. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I think it works well with both single-handed sword and two-handed sword. So I really like that material. I've
Mhm.
yet to get through Marozzo's sword and buckler against partisan stuff, but I think that'll probably be something that I intend to get to pretty soon.
Yeah, that's
Um,
quite awesome actually as well. Yeah.
so you've done that already? You've gone through some of that material, or just read
Yeah.
through?
No,
Really?
we've gone. Or it's still in the same phase. So like I wouldn't be able to shoot it now because I haven't started enough
Gotcha.
to be able to say it with confidence. But yeah, I think it's really awesome, and I think it's also it also applies quite well to sword and rotella and maybe even imbracciatura as well.
Yeah. So are you guys gonna and that's something that I'm excited about, because you guys made that video about making the imbracciatura, and I am really excited to see somebody present some techniques with that, because um, one, I'm going to follow you guys' tutorial. I'm going to build one myself, and two,
Yes.
I'm really looking forward to sort of comparing interpretations of that material, because that will be kind of ending my quest to finish book 2 of Marozzo. That'll be sort of the very last material that I do. So I'm excited to see that.
Yeah, I'm really fortunate to have so motivated students like Stefan, who's also really capable, not just as a sword fighter, but also as a craftsman.
Yeah, he's made some really incredible stuff.
Definitely.
Yeah. All right. So let's see. Yeah. So what else is going on? Do you guys host any events or tournaments in Potsdam?
Yeah, that's actually the plan. So last year, still COVID, but we had like a short 1 month window where we could host a little event outside, like right in front of the palace, which was quite awesome. That's where a few of our videos came to
It's
place.
gorgeous. It's absolutely gorgeous.
That's definitely planned for this year as well, and maybe I fingers crossed, maybe even with a bit more participants from even other nations as well. So we'll see, but that's definitely a regular event in our curriculum now as well. And we definitely want to host a side sword tournament as well. After we participated in the English Side Sword Open, we got into contact with Jay as well. And not only he produces some awesome videos on the two-handed swords, on the partisan, the Ronca as well, but he's also a great guy, and he organizes the Italian and English Side Sword Open. So maybe there will be a German Side Sword Open as well.
Cool. That'd be fantastic. Yeah. Well, hopefully one of these days we'll have to get you over to the United States and
No,
get
that'd
you
be
involved
great.
in some of our events over here. I guess the East Coast is probably easiest to travel to. So perhaps when the North American Bolognese event ends up coming to the East Coast, we'll have to get you over here, because that'd be awesome to have you here, and then we
Yeah,
can do some
sounds great.
sword fighting. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
So tell me a little bit about your involvement with the DDHF and the National Longsword Squad.
Mhm. So, like the DDHF is the German umbrella organization for historical fencing in Germany. And 2 years ago, or maybe last year, they officially founded a longsword squad for women and one for men, with the aim to push longsword fencing or competitive fencing really in Germany to the next level. And there are a few like I'm missing the word, like training sessions that go over a longer time.
Yeah.
So for like a week, and these took actually place last year, or at least one for 5 days, and that was already really great. The aim is to participate in the HEMA tournament this year in like maybe last quarter, like COVID permits, and to really push ourselves as fighters and as competitive athletes. And I think it's really beneficial to just fence with these awesome people.
Yeah, no, definitely. That sounds like a really great opportunity and an honor. It's cool that you're getting an opportunity to do that. And it's also very cool because you're going to be, participating under, a German federation doing Bolognese fencing, which is great.
Yeah,
But
definitely. I'm the only one actually doing Bolognese fencing there. So there's Björn Rüter, you probably know from his YouTube channel as well. He's also in the national squad. He's doing Maya, and I think we're the only Renaissance guys in the men's cadre at least. And yeah, all the other guys pretty much do Lichtenauer. So it's fun to test our sword fighting against it.
Yeah, no, it's a great experience too. Have you, what kind of two-handed sword are you using? Do you have a two-handed sword that has lugs, or what are you using right now for two-handed sword? Just a standard.
So for competitive fencing, I of course use a Feder. Mm-hmm. And for my personal training in two-handed sword, I have like Renaissance longsword, which actually pretty much looks like a Feder, but it's actually longsword in weight and weight distribution. And Stefan has an early Spadona as well, like the one from Regenier, the early Spadona. Yeah, the Spada Aduimani, I think he calls it.
Have you seen the new Regenier Italian Feder?
Yeah, it looks quite fun.
It does look really fun. I mean, have you done any fencing with swords? I mean, like competitive. I know that with some of the bigger swords, it's kind of difficult, but have you done any sort of playful sparring or competitive sparring with two-handed swords that have the lugs on them?
Yeah, so the Spada Aduimani has some lugs. I wouldn't call them really lugs. I think these are pretty small. They aren't really a danger to a training partner. So we tried and sparred playfully with that sword. It's also kind of wobbly. So we'll have to see this summer how it goes. I really would love to get my hand into like big Zweihänder or like real Spadona. I have to see how my budget permits it to get just another sword, and also how my wife permits it. Because actually under my swords all lie under my bed. So that's the most convenient place for me, because then I just stand up, I grab a sword and I start to train. And it's actually getting kind of crowded in there.
Yeah, well, you could always get a bigger bed.
that has to be the next step.
So the reason I was asking about lugs is because I've just recently we had some fetters made for us from Historical Fencing Armory, and fighting with the lugs, and especially fighting people who do KDF, it almost feels like I'm cheating. Because they change the bind dynamics so much.
Definitely.
There's so many actions that they'll try to do on the sword, where they'll try to do a Zornhau or something like that, and they can't finish the Zornhau because when they try to push their point forward, it stops on the lugs and their point is still high. And it's so great fighting those people with, this weapon that kind of in some ways kind of represents this a response to how what feels like a response to the way that two-handed sword fighting kind of progressed, and being able to sort of have that advantage and just kind of dominate them with that sword just feels so good. But I guess
it's really like a forward cross that like really protects your hand surprisingly well.
Yeah, yeah. I think Marozzo actually in his stretta techniques for two-handed sword actually calls it the forward cross. Um, so, and it's really interesting when you look at his strata material because so much of it is like in KDF you have the wrenching, right?
Hmm.
Which is essentially where you'll take your cross guard and you'll kind of wrench your opponent up and then perhaps go through and try to go for a grapple or something like that. Marazzo does the same things, but he does it essentially what he says would be at the forward cross. So he has one play where you end up doing wrenching. There's another one where you end up going for sort of a blade grab. Once their sword is fallen into your lugs, he says you grab up underneath the forward cross, and then go and essentially go for that disarm that Arto Pharma does so well.
Yeah,
um,
definitely.
but it's just it feels like carrying a machine gun in like the 1800s. It's just such an advancement in weaponry with something so simple.
Yeah, definitely. And it's like we see these weapons like an evolution of weapons and armor, depending on the context they were used in. That's really great, which
Yeah,
really helps us to understand how these weapons actually were used.
yeah, and yeah, it's pretty fascinating. My one of my pet theories is that Lichtenauer actually learned most of his fighting in the Hundred Years' War and then came down and was a mercenary in the Italian Wars, as most people were during the time. I know that rankles some people, but that's my pet theory.
Yeah, I like that.
Well, I mean, he says he traveled far and, or well, at least
Definitely.
Danzig says that he traveled far and wide to learn the art. So we don't really know where he went. Some people think that he went up north and was fighting close to you in the Hussite Wars, right?
Mhm.
Um, and uh, and I think that there's much better combat going on in Italy in the late 1400s or mid 1400s. So that's where I like to put him. All right, man. Well, it's been absolutely awesome having you here. Do you have any final thoughts?
Well, thank you first for having me. It was a real pleasure to talk with you and like really insightful as well. So it's great to be here. I hope this podcast will actually inspire more people to just pick up their video cam and record their training sessions. Like even their simplest sparring sessions, like their technique interpretations, don't be shy. It's all very much appreciated.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love that. That's a great way to end this. Yeah, thanks again for coming on, and look forward to meeting you soon. Hopefully, we'll get out of this pandemic and we'll be able to get together and enjoy some fencing with one another. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, mate.
Yeah. And that concludes another episode of Le Arte dell'Armée, the Bolognese podcast. I want to thank Martin for coming on again and sharing his wisdom with us. Next week's guest is going to be Jay Maxwell. Jay and I are going to banter back and forth about all the things that make Bolognese amazing and essential. So stay tuned for that and stay saucy, my friends.